All right, a couple of videos ago, we said that we were going to drill into all of the different types of antennas that are out there. And so in this video, we're going to do just that. We're going to take a look at our directional antennas and semi-directionals and omnidirectionals and see what different types exist out there. Keeping in mind that if we're ever going to deploy an antenna, we should always pay special attention to not just the type of antenna that it is, but also the rating and the coverage patterns and whatnot. But, just starting with this idea of what is a Yagi antenna and what is a dish antenna, it's going to give us a strong foundation for when we go to look at purchasing or deploying certain antenna types. So let's dive in. All right, first up, we have our omnidirectional antennas. So there's two primary types that I would say fall into this category. We have the dipoles that we've talked about, which are intended to really give us as close to that spherical nature as possible. But then we also have, technically speaking, it's the same name, but a category that exceeds or goes outside of the dipole concept, which is more this omni type. And the omni, this is going to be more of that donut shape. And so the important thing to recognize about this omnidirectional type of antenna is that if we look at the access point from above, it's going to look like a circle. And so we might assume that it's supposed to be close to a sphere. However, once again, we turn it on its side and we see that it's more of a donut shape, meaning that there are going to be some amount of lack of coverage up here at the poles. And that's interesting because that means we have a very small dead zone right underneath the antenna. So we do need to be sensitive to that. However, the lower the gain the antenna, the better off we'll be from that perspective. That dead zone isn't going to be very large. However, as we increase the gain and everything stretches out a little bit more, well, now we see that we are going to have a larger dead space underneath the antenna. Now next we have the category that we might call a planar type of antenna. These are semi-directional in nature and they consist of two primary types. We have the patch antenna, which is pretty common, and then we also have panel antennas, which in my experience are a little bit less common, and ultimately they're trying to accomplish the same thing, they're just built very differently internally. Again, these are semi-directional antennas, meaning that they are going to stretch out in front of them a little bit, but usually semi-directional antennas are still trying to connect to clients. When we get to directional antennas, we very rarely are trying to connect to clients. Directionally, that's usually to extend a wireless bridging type of connection. And so a lot of times we might think of these in hallways or possibly broadcasting out into maybe the outdoor space. And the idea is that we've got a patch or a panel antenna and it's broadcasting out in this type of pattern. Now, typically there's some imperfection here. For example, it might look a little bit more like a bulb coming out the front, which makes sense when we think about that balloon analogy. And then we've got a little bit of this bulb back behind it. And so it's not going to be perfectly directional. It's not going to go nearly as far as a directional, and that's fine, because again, our purpose is to try to service all of the clients in this area. Now, next up is the Yagi antenna. The Yagi antenna is an interesting one, because this is also semi-directional. However, it's going to be a little bit more directional than the planar antennas are. But when I think of a Yagi antenna, I typically think of a TV antenna that's outside of a house. I actually have one of these on the outside of my house. It was here when I moved in, and I haven't actually used it, but hey, it's there if I want it. And so typically this is going to look like, if we've got a wireless tower, let's say, and then we throw this antenna up top. And so we're going to have different elements that extend out sort of like branches. And then we have a receiver down here that's intended to catch these signals as they come in. Now, these can be used to broadcast out towards clients as well, but again, they are a little bit more directional than our planar antennas. And so we might find ourselves using this also for short point-to-point links. Maybe we've got another Yagi antenna over here that we're using to send our signals back and forth. Now, next up is the sector antenna. A sector antenna is interesting because it's also considered to be semi-directional, but we're seeing that even though these can be labeled as semi-directional, that they really can be very different from one another. And so a sector antenna is designed still to communicate with clients, and it's going to be a little bit more focused on providing a wide angle. And this angle can vary. It's usually about 120 degrees, but it could certainly be below that. It could be above that. Technically, they could go all the way up to 180 degrees, but usually we're looking at something like this. And so the idea here is I can deploy my access point in my antenna, and 120 degrees is sort of like this, I would say. It's like a third of a circle. And so I can cover this entire area. Now, what's interesting about the sector antenna is it's designed to be able to be deployed into what we'd call an array. So now I've got one pointing up here like we had, but I also have one pointing down here and one pointing down here. If they're all 120 degrees, then I add 3 of these together, and I get the full 360 degrees. And so now I'm actually covering all 3 directions all the way around this array. This is very commonly used on cell towers. If you ever see a cell tower, you'll see an array of antennas, and they go around the tower. We're not putting one gigantic omnidirectional antenna onto a cell tower and expecting to cover a large range. Instead, we have lots of radios and lots of these antennas in an array, and we're trying to surround the area by deploying them in this fashion. Now next we have the dish antenna. The dish antenna is our first antenna that we're going to talk about that's truly a directional antenna. When we talk about directional antennas, these are really not intended to service clients. Instead, these are going to be used for point-to-point links instead. And so a wireless bridge type of scenario here. We might have some kind of wireless tower, or maybe we're up on a rooftop, let's say, and we're going to deploy a dish antenna. And so these dish antennas look something like this, and we have a very, very narrow beam path. We talked about this earlier on in this skill. And so they're sending to one another like this, and we have to be very, very cautious about the alignment of these antennas. Because if they're slightly out of alignment, then we might actually send our signal above or below the other side. And that certainly wouldn't be good, so let's not do that. Now, dish antennas, they are going to leverage this parabola concept. We talked about this earlier on as well. There's a whole lot of math behind the concept of a parabola. It's actually pretty fun. We have the concept of a focus right there in the middle of the parabola. And the idea here is that any part of the parabola that gets hit at any angle is going to pass through the focus in the middle. And so that's the advantage here, is as long as a little bit of signal hits the edge of the parabola, let's say, it should get reflected through the receiver that's right there at the mathematical focus. Now lastly, we do have one more type, which is the grid antenna. The grid antenna is basically like a dish antenna. It actually uses the same principles. Other than that, it is a metallic mesh. And so it's going to look a little something like this, where we do still form a parabola. However, we're not doing it as a solid piece of metal. Instead, this is going to allow the wind, for example, to pass through it. And so this is going to be very, very good in windy environments. But again, because it's similar to a dish antenna and it's using the parabola concept, this will be a directional antenna, and we should only be using it primarily for point-to-point links, and we wouldn't be using that for client connectivity. So as we can see, there's a lot of different types of antennas, and each one is going to have a unique pattern that it uses for the propagation of signal. And so as we look at some of these for examples, we see these dipoles and omnidirectionals and planars. These are primarily designed for client connectivity. However, we do see some other ones as well, but these are the ones we're primarily going to use indoors. Now, we do have Yagi and dish and other directional antennas that are used for wireless bridging. And there's more than that. We even covered the Yagis and the sector antennas, which are sort of in between, and they can also service clients in a semi-directional fashion. And so, again, there's just a lot of varieties of antennas out there. As long as we understand kind of what we're signing up for when we're purchasing a particular type of antenna, that's going to help us to understand how it should also be deployed. But ultimately, we do still need to make sure that we're getting the proper coverage by looking at its spec sheets and its charts. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click here to subscribe to CBT Nuggets and click the notification bell to make sure that you're aware of every time we post new content. If you're interested in a career in IT or you want to brush up on your IT skills, then swing over to our website, and while you're there, be sure to sign up for a free trial.